Swift Arrow's first winter away from home passed quickly. He often joined the braves in hunting animals for food. He became experienced with use of the bow and arrow and the gun, and Big Wolf taught him to recognize animal tracks in caves that animals lived in. He taught George to recognize bruised leaves or slight scrapes on the tree trunks as signs of animals nearby. The weather was mild that winter and the snow light. This allowed George to spend much time practicing in the oval arena. Probably to help build his confidence, the teacher first drilled George on running, a sport that he soon mastered. Within a few months, George learned to outdistance the Indian boys of his own age and many of the older ones. Now the boys looked at him with more respect. And still the teacher continued to drill him at wrestling. Some days it rained, but the teacher did not let up. At evening, George would emerge from the arena black with mud. Mud caked his hair and his ears, and even his mouth tasted of mud. But George learned that winter to be a champion wrestler. Nobody felt more pleased about George's new success than Big Wolf. He regarded the boy proudly, and during council with the warriors often boasted of George's achievements. Swift Arrow has become as true an Indian as any of us in the village, Big Wolf would say. Soon he will be the bravest and strongest. Already his muscles bulge as hard as steel. And it was true. George had gathered much new strength during the winter, and on the long marches and hunting trips, he learned to endure cold and hunger as well as many Indians. But what Big Wolf did not realize was that George had not become a true Indian at all. He acted like one publicly, but privately his thoughts strayed to his home and his parents. He longingly he thought longingly of the good food Ma cooked, and remembered the pretty fairness of his sister Zella and Robert's sister Becky, how they contrasted to the stern bronze maidens of the Indian village. Would he ever see them again? Every day now George prayed that God would help him find his way back home. He had lost all hope that Pa and the other settlers could ever track him down in this wilderness, but he still felt sure God would somehow lead him back to them. Spring arrived, and George rejoiced to see tender buds bursting from the brown tree branches. He and his friends raced their ponies along the wooded paths and through fields decorated with dainty wild flowers, yellow, orange, and purple. They passed men making new canoes and women planting the fields with corn and vegetables. George thought it strange to see the women working in the fields, but he knew that was the Indian custom. Pa's probably planting his fields right now too, George thought, and I ought to be there to help him. Well, someday I'll be there. Just wait. George made a new friend that spring, a tall, muscular Indian boy named White Rabbit. George judged the boy to be about his own age. They spent many hours together in the fields and woods, and had fun wrestling and racing each other in the arena. First one would win, then the other. Of all the Indian boys George had met, White Rabbit seemed the kindest and most understanding. But it was only to his little sister Ewanah that George revealed the true secrets of his heart. When he felt sad and lonely, he would go to her and talk about home and family he missed so much. You would like it, Ewanah. I know you would. The homes are made from logs. They are always dry, and the wind does not blow in. Ma and Pa sleep on a soft bed, and the rest of us, a bed? What is a bed? Ewanah would interrupt. A bed? Why, it's something called a mattress that rests off the ground on top of wooden boards. Mattress is soft and stuffed with feathers from geese and ducks, and people lie down on the mattress to sleep. Inwa would look puzzled, but nod her little head as though she understood. Would you like would you not like to live in such a warm house, Inwa? Oh no, Swift Arrow. I am an Indian. I would die if I had to live in such a way. Then George would tell her about the good food Ma cooked. She makes something called bread. It's made from grinding wheat grain, and as the squaws grinds the grain of corn. Ma mixes it up real good and then puts it into long, narrow pans. When the bread is baked, it is the same shape as the pan. It has a hard crust on the outside and soft brown dough on the inside. Noah giggled. I would like to eat such food, she whispered. Do you think you could make some? No, I'm not sure I could. Um, I am sure I could not. George answered indignantly. Ma and my sisters did all the cooking. Cooking's for women, not men. How do women have time to make such food, Swift Arrow? Do they not hoe the fields and plant the corn? No, that work is left to the men who are stronger. Women keep busy all day with their cooking and other jobs like weaving carpets and cloth and knitting. Knitting? Inwa looked puzzled again. Sure, knitting. The women take the wool from the back of sheep and spin it into string. Then they take long needles and sort of loop the string all together so that it is smooth and warm and can be made into warm coverings for the feet and hands and neck. Inwa shrugged her shoulders. Well, I do not know what these words needle and string mean, but I'm sure it must be just as you say, Swift Arrow. Then she would playfully pull at his dark hair, and he would chase her until they both fell down laughing. Though Inwa did not understand all that George told her about his home, she did understand one thing very clearly. She knew that she must never breathe a word of the things he told her to Big Wolf or any of the other Indians. If they knew that he still thought longingly of home, they would probably beat him or maybe even kill him. One day, when George was hiking with Big Wolf through the forest, his curiosity got the best of him. More than anything, he wanted to know if Ma and Pa had been killed in the Indian raid or if they still lived. Surely Big Wolf could tell him that much. As the two sat down to rest on a log, George finally plucked up the courage to blurt out his question. Honored Father, will you please give me an answer to one question that keeps me sad wondering? The chief's cold black eyes bored into him, and George hurried on. The day I was taken from my home, I saw smoke coming through the windows of my house. Were my father and mother killed that day? What about Robert, the friend that was taken with me? Big Wolf fixed George with a fierce look that seemed to freeze him to the log. George wanted to run, but his legs would not move. For a long time, the chief continued to stare at George with a look of pure fury. Finally, George could take it no longer and tripped backward over the log, scurried frantically into the woods. Would the chief kill him for his daring question? Get back here, Big Wolf roared, and the command stopped George in his tracks. He slowly returned and sat on the log. Big Wolf seized George by the shoulders and shook him like Inwa's dog shook the long-nosed rats he caught nibbling in the food storage place. I am your father, Big Wolf cried, as he continued to shake the terrified George. I am your father, and you have no mother. Then Big Wolf stopped shaking George, and the Indian suddenly looked very tired. Swift Arrow, you are not a prisoner here, he said in a gentler voice. You are with your own people now. Nobody so strong and brave and clever as you was born to be a paleface. You may have been born among the palefaces, but you were born to be an Indian. You are with your own people now, and you must forget the other days when you were a weak papoose. How dare you think of that friend of yours who is a sickly rabbit, weaker than a squaw? Forget him, and forget that other life. Never again speak to me of that which is not worth remembering. You will be told what you are to know. Big Wolf rose abruptly from the log and strode back toward the village. George followed, careful to keep a safe distance behind. He may think he can make me forget my ma and pa, but he can't, George thought stubbornly. He can't tell what's going on inside my head. Someday I'll show him. For several days, Big Wolf ignored George, but gradually his heart began to melt. As he watched George play with the other Indian boys and follow the many Indian customs, he must have decided that George really was becoming a good Indian after all. He and George resumed their hunting and hiking together, and occasionally Big Wolf even discussed some of the business of governing the village with George. George listened eagerly and tried hard to please this chief who had obviously come to love him as a son. One of George's greatest ordeals was learning to swim. Water had frightened him ever since the time he almost drowned when he was about 2 or 3 years old. George watched the Indian boys and decided they could swim almost as well as the fish in the lake. But no matter how much time they spent showing George just the right motions to make in the water, George could not swim. Every time he lifted his feet from the lake bottom, his head would sink under the water, and he'd cough and sputter, thinking he would drown for sure. George's failure to swim became a great worry to Big Wolf. Every Indian boy must swim. Sometimes the ability to swim even saved their lives. The chief often reproached George about swimming and accused him of not trying hard enough. One day, the chief called George to him. Come, Swift Arrow, today we will take a canoe onto the lake and go fishing. George had often gone fishing on a lake with Big Wolf, so he expected nothing unusual. Instead, he gladly ran for their fishing lines and little pot of bait and was opposite Big Wolf in the canoe within minutes. Usually, George did the paddling on such fishing trips, but today, Big Wolf surprised him by reaching for the paddle himself. The slender prow of the light canoe cut swiftly through the deep blue water as the chief's powerful arms dipped and pulled the paddle. Not until they had gone about 100 yards from shore did he stop. What do you think we'll catch today? George asked eagerly. Big Wolf gave him an amused look. Today we will see a big fish swim. The answer puzzled George. Hadn't he seen many big fish swim? What he wanted was to catch a big fish. Oh, well, who can know what the chief is thinking, George said to himself. Anyway, it's too beautiful a day to worry. After a few minutes of quiet fishing, the chief began struggling with his line. Big fish, he exclaimed. So soon? George asked, and He turned around to watch the chief land his fish. As he turned, a powerful shove and lift from behind sent George spinning into the deep lake. "Help! Help!" George cried, swallowing big gulps of water as he opened his mouth and reached frantically for the canoe. But it was not there. "Help! Help!" George thrashed and kicked as he felt himself sinking under the water. Where was the chief? Why did he not help? The chief knew he couldn't swim. George's head bobbed to the surface, and what he saw made him regain his senses. The chief was paddling away, apparently not at all concerned about George's cries. The Indian did not even look back to see how he made out. Why, he did it purposefully, George thought, when between sputtering gasps for breath. He purposefully pushed me into the water so I'd have to swim. Then George realized that he was already keeping afloat. He had unconsciously began moving his arms and legs as the boys had told him to do so many times before. But this time it worked. Now, what else had they said about swimming? He tried to remember their careful instructions, and before long he found himself slowly moving through the water toward shore. He cupped the palms of his hands and pushed down on the water as though he wanted to push it under him. Then he kicked his feet in time with the movements of his arms. "I'm swimming, I'm swimming," he kept repeating to himself. He looked towards Big Wolf's canoe and saw the chief had stopped but was carefully ignoring his struggling son. "I guess he'd rather have me drown than have me continue such a babyish habit as being scared of the water." Now he began lifting his arms high over his head and putting them into the water, and he discovered the more powerful thrusts made him move faster. He turned his head from side to side to take big breaths and kicked harder with his feet. The shore seemed to come closer and closer. Then he noticed a large group of boys gathered on the shore. They were waving their hands and shouting something. "Swift Arrow swims! Swift Arrow swims!" he heard them call. When he reached shallow water, he put down his feet and walked to the shore. As the boys cheered, George began cheering too. He shouted with the rest of them and laughed when a few broke into a brief Indian war dance. George looked back at the lake and saw that Big Wolf had began paddling toward shore. When the chief came out of the water, he pulled the canoe onto dry ground and walked away without saying a word. He had a pleasant twinkle in his dark eyes, and George knew that he felt pleased. As the spring days passed to summer, George spent much time in the water. He learned to tread water, float, dive, and swim under water. By the beginning of winter, he was winning not only many land races, but water races as well. The first few winters George spent at the Indian village passed quickly for him because there were so many new things to learn. But by the time he was about 15, he began to dread winter. The experiences had grown old and no longer fascinated him. The cold winds and snow made it impossible to wrestle in the arena or practice running and jumping. Much of the lake lay frozen, so of course he couldn't swim. Snowdrifts piled too high in the woods to risk riding Nico very far. But George noticed the lack of something to do didn't seem to bother the other braves. In fact, they welcomed the chance to sleep or rest lazily on piles of skin while they watched the squaws cook, make pottery, or sew skins together for clothes. The Indians must have thought it queer when they saw George come in front of the forest carrying huge loads of firewood for the squaw. Big Wolf looked questioningly at him, and finally White Rabbit called George aside and told him not to bother himself with Squaw's work. So now, what can I do with myself? George wondered silently. Then he remembered something. Robert's sister Becky had made a playhouse back in Germantown, and how the girls had loved to play in it. It had been made big enough for the girls to walk around in. Some of the ladies furnished old dishes and a few kettles, and Mrs. Stewart had even made some curtains for the windows. Why not make a playhouse for Ewanah? George thought. She'd love it, and the other little girls will flock to it too. George could hardly wait to begin. First, he searched in the snowy woods for logs just the right thickness. He even took his hatchet to chop down a few young trees. Then he hauled the logs to a clear area near Ewanah's wigwam and began the slow task of splitting them. "What are you doing, Swift Arrow?" Ewanah asked the day he deposited the logs in the clearing. George just smiled. "Please, Swift Arrow, tell me what you are doing. It's a surprise." "A surprise for me?" "Yes, for you." "Will I like it?" "I hope so." "Oh, please, tell me what it is." George refused to tell and just continued his work. Every day, Ewanah came to watch as George notched logs and fitted them together. He built the little house as he remembered his father had built their cabin in the settlement. What he could not remember, he improvised. In just a few days, the cabin began to take shape, and Ewanah guessed what he was building. "It looks like the log houses that you say your people live in, Swift Arrow. Is that what you were building?" "It is a little house like the big houses of my people. When I finish building it, you can play with your friends." Ewanah jumped up and down and cried little cries of delight. "Oh, Swift Arrow, you are the most wonderful of all brothers in the village. When will it be finished? You must hurry before the snow becomes too deep for you to work outside." "If you're in such a hurry, then you can just help me." "Can I really? What can I do?" George showed Ewanah how to mix mud and push it into the cracks between the logs, just as he had done with his years before. "The mud will keep out the snow and cold winds. If you work carefully, your little house will be the warmest place in the whole village." For the next few days, Ewanah's slender legs climbed all over the cabin as she carefully poked mud into the cracks. When George finished the outside, he began eagerly on the inside. First, he made a fireplace of sticks and clay. Then, with his hatchet and knife, he fashioned a small table and two stools, fitting their parts together with pins as Pa had done with the ones he made for Ma. He pegged crude shelves on both sides of the fireplace. Because of the affairs of the government, he had kept the chief. Because of the affairs of government had kept the chief especially busy that winter, George saw him little, but sometimes wondered uncomfortably just how Big Wolf would react to having his precious daughter play in a pale-faced cabin. Would he be angry? One morning, as George sat inside the little house, smoothing logs for the floor, he looked out the door to see Big Wolf walking toward him. George hastily dropped his tools and stepped outside to meet the chief. "It is good to see you, honored father. You have been working too hard lately." "I see you too have been working hard. Every morning I look and I see the little house looks more nearly finished." Big Wolf did not smile as he spoke, and his eyes seemed to bore holes through George as they always did when he was angry. Just then Ewanah stepped out of her wigwam. Seeing her Seeing her, the chief look softened. "Oh, father, do you see the beautiful playhouse my brother has built for me? Is it not wonderful? And will I not have great fun playing inside? Come inside and see the table and stools and the fireplace that Swift Arrow has made." Big Wolf did as she asked and nodded his head in approval at the furniture. He ran his hand over the smooth tabletop and carefully examined the fireplace. "Now winter will not be so tiresome for me, father. I can play with my friends in my old house. And is it not very warm inside?" It seemed that Big Wolf could not be angry about the pale-faced house when his daughter felt so delighted with it. "It is good that your brother has made this house for you. Be careful when you play that you don't hurt yourself," the chief said. When he walked outside, the curious squaws noted that he was smiling. Now that the house had the blessing of the chief, it seemed that every squaw in the village wanted to see inside. Most of them had never seen a pale-face house. Every day, old, wrinkled grandmas and pretty young maidens came and poked their heads through the doorway and watched George finish the floor. When he had, when at last he had finished, squaws began leaving little gifts inside for Ewanah. One brought a pair of brightly painted pots. Another brought an old kettle which George hung over the fireplace. Still another, a pretty china sugar bowl on the table. Painted brown flowers decorated its side, and a lid sat on top. George knew that it must be a prize brought by some raiding party. Finally, Inwa's own old grandmother came with a fluffy brown bearskin and laid it proudly before the fireplace. Now that George had completed the house, he began working on another project. Every evening, Inwa saw him carving a small piece of wood. First, he worked it into a round shape. Then he began notching and cutting. He called Inwa to sit down before him and spent several minutes studying her face. When next she came back, she discovered that he had fashioned a little wooden head and that looked a great deal like her. Next, he cut some doe skin from one of the skins he slept on, borrowed a bone needle and tough thread from the old squaw, and began sewing. When he finished the sewing, he held a crudely shaped body. He fashioned arms and legs to it with leather thongs, and so they moved. When he had finished fastening the head to the body, George discovered to his surprise that the old squaw had been working too. She smiled a toothless grin and handed him a delicate beaded dress and tiny moccasins. "Yes, this is just what we need," George exclaimed gratefully. He quickly slipped the dress over the head, and the squaw nodded her approval. When Inwa saw the finished toy, she cried for joy. "Oh, a baby! A little wooden papoose for me to play with." George laughed. "My sister at home used to call these dolls, and my grandfather in Germantown called them poppets. So, Inwa, I've made you a poppet." The squaw made a papoose board for Inwa, and she carried the doll on her back everywhere she went about the village. At first, the other squaws looked at the doll suspiciously. Perhaps they thought it was a real baby, but when they at last realized it was a little toy, they began to wish their girls had one to play with. Thus George kept himself busy many of those cold winter days making poppets for the little Indian maidens.